The medieval period was a time of entrenched order. Rules were rigid, expectations were clear, and power was heavily concentrated. Yet, beneath this structured world of knights, kings, and clergy, there was another force at work, the engine of women who, in the face of profound legal and social restrictions, discovered ways to subvert the system. These women, often written out of the history books or cast aside as mere footnotes, found the cracks, the loopholes, and the silent rebellions that allowed them to survive and even thrive despite the suffocating weight of medieval society. It's in their stories, often buried beneath the layers of time, that we can uncover a hidden chapter of history. In the earliest centuries of the medieval world, the social structure was designed to keep women under strict control, subject to the authority of their fathers, husbands, or the church. The concept of ownership permeated every aspect of life. Women were legally considered the property of their male relatives or husbands, with no autonomy over their own lives, bodies, or even their income. Yet, through sheer ingenuity, women began to carve out spaces where they could escape these constraints, though they did so in silence, under the radar, often in ways that would make the men in power look away in confusion. Take, for example, the curious case of a cat in medieval England. Not just any cat, but one that, by some strange twist of fate, found itself signing documents on behalf of a merchant who could not be present. The cat's paw print, considered more credible than a woman's signature, was officially accepted by the authorities, and so, the cat became a trusted partner in business, more reliable, in the eyes of the law, than a woman. It may seem absurd, but this curious anomaly underscores a powerful truth about the medieval world. Women were kept in a state of perpetual disempowerment, while the rules of the system turned a blind eye to equally absurd exceptions. And so, women, ever resourceful, adapted. They learned to play the game by the rules while quietly rewriting the script in the shadows. When women were excluded from official economic life, they created their own. Historians have uncovered records of women who ran businesses without ever being officially acknowledged as owners. They used clandestine networks, coded messages, and symbolic gestures to communicate in the open market while remaining unseen by the male-dominated authorities. Take, for instance, the women in Venice who ran secret trading operations using laundry lines to signal market prices to one another. It was an utterly brilliant system, relying on an innocuous object, the laundry line, to transmit vital information. When the authorities caught on, they could do nothing. There was no law against the arrangement. The world of business, then, was not as male-dominated as they thought. It simply depended on who was doing the asking and who was willing to bend the rules. The excuses for this gendered oppression were both laughable and tragic. Women were considered too emotional, too weak, and too simple to engage in anything as complex as managing finances. Yet records from the time show men regularly brawling over small financial disputes, while women, often left in charge of household finances, kept their families from going bankrupt. One woman, for example, was the steward of her family's savings for 20 years, while her husband invested everything in a futile search for Mermit's real plan. According to some medieval records, in such a world, a woman's ability to think clearly, to survive by wit and intelligence, was not just valuable, it was vital. This cleverness in the face of adversity became second nature for women. Survival required the ability to outsmart the very system designed to limit their potential. And so, over time, women developed an extraordinary set of skills. Not just in business or trade, but in the art of reading people, of understanding the motivations of those who wielded power, and manipulating them to their advantage. They learned to play the roles expected of them, but they did so with layers of hidden meaning and quiet rebellion. Education, for example, was a tool of oppression. Women were not supposed to learn to read, for fear they would gain dangerous ideas. Yet many noblewomen managed to teach themselves and others under the guise of piety. One noblewoman cleverly disguised her lessons in reading by claiming she was simply teaching her servants to count prayer beads. By the time the church realized they had inadvertently created an underground literacy network, it was far too late to shut it down. Another noblewoman used this subtle defiance to teach entire communities, eventually spreading literacy through multiple counties. When the powers that be, like the church, sought to suppress these hidden actions, they only empowered more women to do the same. This ingenuity was not confined to education. It extended to every aspect of life: business, property. Women, barred from owning property in their own right, found ways to gain control over their lives. In 1367, for example, a woman ran her husband's business while he took naps in the back room. The husband, perfectly content with the arrangement, called it delegation. But in reality, it was a form of quiet rebellion, a tactical move that allowed the wife to manage and to profit from what was legally considered her husband's property. The ways in which women subverted these social rules often left authorities scratching their heads, unsure of how to categorize them. Sometimes, these subversive women found a way to turn social expectations against those who sought to control them. Women, often portrayed as hysterical or emotional, learned how to exploit these very stereotypes to get what they wanted. One woman, for example, used hysterical fits of crying to avoid paying taxes, while another avoided a marriage proposal by feigning a mysterious illness that caused her to speak in riddles. Each of these women mastered a system that, on the surface, was designed to suppress the man, used it to achieve their own ends. One of the most ingenious strategies women employed was leveraging the power of widowhood. Widows, unlike married women, had the legal right to own property and make contracts. In some towns, widows made up a disproportionate percentage of business owners. Widows also had the freedom to refuse remarriage, creating a class of independent women who were able to thrive in ways that married women could only dream of. One widow, for instance, bought her late husband's business at auction, the very business she had been running while he spent their wealth on hunting dogs. In this new reality, a widow's independence became a kind of quiet power, one that many women strove to achieve. But as always, the authorities grew wary. A rumor began to spread that widows were becoming too powerful. The church attempted to rein in this growing independence by preaching the virtues of a quiet, prayerful life. But for many women, that meant little. The more they resisted, the more they found ways to fight back. A widow in France, for example, launched a mourning accessories business. In a society where mourning was a highly formalized ritual, this woman's business allowed her to create an entirely new identity for herself. It was a business that both provided her financial independence and made it nearly impossible for anyone to pressure her into remarriage. Yet, despite the growing power of widows, the ultimate weapon used against women who defied the system was an accusation that still carries weight today: the accusation of witchcraft. The mere whisper of the word which was enough to destroy a woman's life. In the towns and villages of medieval Europe, women who were perceived as too independent, those who ran businesses, those who kept their own money, or those who simply did not conform to the expected role of a docile wife, were branded as witches. The accusations were always absurd. A woman who knew how to read, a woman whose cows produced more milk than others, a woman who was too good at business, all were labeled witches. To be accused of witchcraft was not just a social stigma, it was a death sentence. And yet, some women played the system. Even here, they used humor, clever arguments, and even subterfuge to fight back. When one woman was accused of using witchcraft to make her cows produce more milk, she pointed out that if the devil were truly helping her, he wasn't doing a very good job, since she still had to wake up early every morning to milk the cows herself. These stories of medieval rebellion, of women who learned to read between the lines of law, who used intelligence to escape the bonds of social expectation, are not just fascinating relics of history. They are evidence of a deep, persistent undercurrent of resistance. They remind us that even in the darkest corners of human history, there were those who fought, in quiet but powerful ways, against the forces that sought to oppress them. In the centuries that followed the medieval period, the stories of these resilient women remained largely invisible, their contributions buried beneath layers of time and tradition. The histories written by men often ignored or overlooked the power of women, reducing them to mere footnotes or, worse, erasing them entirely. Yet, in the gaps left by these omissions, the whispers of these women's stories continue to echo. Their legacy is not only one of survival, but also of quiet revolution, subtly altering the course of history in ways that were impossible to ignore. In recent years, historians and scholars have begun to excavate these forgotten histories, seeking out the names and deeds of women who lived in the shadows of the past. By uncovering the stories of these medieval women, we can begin to understand how they shaped the world around them, challenging the dominant narratives and leaving behind a hidden trail of influence. What once seemed like isolated acts of rebellion are now understood as part of a broader, unspoken movement that spans centuries. Today, we are starting to recognize the invaluable contributions of these women, not just as survivors, but as architects of change. In many ways, the forgotten women of the medieval period laid the foundation for the advances we see in women's rights today. They were not simply the passive victims of their time. They were active agents of transformation. Through their intelligence, courage, and determination, they defied the limitations placed on them and built new worlds within the confines of the old. One of the most profound aspects of this historical reclamation is the recognition that these women were not isolated individuals. They were part of larger networks of women supporting one another, whether through trade, healing, or espionage. These women forged alliances that transcended social boundaries. They built communities of resistance, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes hidden in the margins, but always striving to make a space for themselves within a world that sought to confine them. These networks of women, though often invisible to history, were the lifeblood of medieval society. It is through them that we begin to see how women, even in the most oppressive of times, managed to find power in solidarity, in secret alliances, and in the quiet, everyday acts of defiance. These women understood that survival was not enough. It was about creating change, no matter how small, and passing that spirit of resistance down to future generations. Down in modern times, we are fortunate to have access to a wealth of historical sources that allow us to bring these stories to light. We can now tell the stories of the healers, the spies, the businesswomen, and the rebels who shaped the medieval world. But even as we reclaim their voices, we must remember that the struggle they began is far from over. The fight for gender equality is an ongoing one. The historical journey of women has been one of overcoming systemic barriers, breaking down stereotypes, and claiming space in a world that often tries to silence them. The medieval women who defied the odds, carved out their own niches, and built alternative systems of power did so in an environment that was far less forgiving than our own. And yet, they did so with ingenuity, resilience, and a fierce sense of self-determination. As we look back at the past, we must also look forward, understanding that the struggles of those who came before us are not just historical artifacts. They are a call to action, a reminder that change is possible, even in the most oppressive of circumstances. The legacy of these women is a legacy of revolution, of quiet resistance, and of the transformative power of solidarity. In reclaiming these stories, we not only honor the women of the past but also empower the women of today and tomorrow, the medieval women who fought against the system through trade, medicine, espionage, and resistance laid the groundwork for the world we now inhabit. And as we continue to push for justice and equality, we can draw strength from their example, remembering that no matter how invisible we may seem, we all have the power to make history. A final thought: the lives of medieval women, hidden in the folds of history, are a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. They remind us that history is not just written in grand gestures, monumental battles, or famous names. It is also written in the everyday acts of rebellion, of survival, of solidarity. The women of the medieval period may have been invisible in the eyes of their contemporaries, but their influence continues to shape the world today. In reclaiming their stories, we not only revive the past, but we also carry the torch forward, a torch that continues to light the way for all those who fight for a world where their voices will never again be silenced. While the stories of these resilient women are often relegated to the shadows of history, their impact has endured through centuries. They may have been written out of the official chronicles, their achievements overlooked or misattributed, but they left a legacy that transcends the medieval period. They sowed the seeds of rebellion, autonomy, and defiance that would grow into the seeds of modern feminist movements. In medieval society, women often had to navigate the labyrinth of laws and customs that systematically confined them. But beneath the surface, they were quietly building their own spaces of power. The evidence may not be in grand titles or official documents, but in the small, often imperceptible actions that they took to reshape the world around them. Take the brewing industry. For example, in many parts of medieval Europe, women were the primary brewers of ale, a staple in the daily life of common folk. Brewing, once considered an essential domestic skill, had evolved into a thriving business, yet it was largely overlooked by the historians of the time. Monasteries, for instance, often controlled ale production, but this didn't stop women from participating in the craft. They worked behind the scenes, creating secret networks of brewers who would supply the local taverns and inns, often bypassing the increasingly male-dominated guild system. The fact that women were often relegated to the kitchen or the hearth did not prevent them from seizing the reins of economic power. Ale brewing was one of the many ways they engaged in commerce, with women finding ways to navigate the constraints of gendered labor. Despite being legally excluded from positions of authority within the craft, women created their own parallel systems of power, running businesses and managing wealth in ways that largely escaped the notice of the authorities. Then there were the clandestine healers, women who acted as midwives and herbalists in a world where medicine was a male-dominated domain. These women possessed a vast body of knowledge, passed down through generations of women, that allowed them to navigate not only the physical challenges of their time, but the social ones. These were women who understood the healing properties of plants, herbs, and natural remedies, often better than the medical professionals of their day. Despite the advances in medieval medical science, it was still common for women to be the primary caregivers. In rural communities, they were the first line of defense against disease, often performing surgeries, delivering babies, and providing care with an arsenal of knowledge far more extensive than that of the average doctor. But the authorities had little use for women's medicine, dismissing it as folk knowledge or, worse, as witchcraft. In fact, many women who were skilled healers were later accused of sorcery for simply being too effective at their craft. And yet, these women persisted. They continued to practice in secret, using their knowledge to heal and protect their communities. Even in the face of persecution, in this hidden world of female power, women also began to create alliances, often across regions, nations, and even social classes. One of the most interesting examples comes from the underground networks of women who served as spies during times of war. While men fought on the front lines, women played a critical role in gathering intelligence and passing messages, often through clandestine means. They were the trusted confidants of soldiers, diplomats, and nobles, quietly orchestrating strategies that would change the course of history. These women, much like the earlier examples of businesswomen and healers, worked outside of the established Systems of power, using their gender as a tool for evasion. By exploiting their perceived frailty, they were able to slip unnoticed through the cracks of a system that thought it had relegated them to domestic tasks. They used their social positions to move through spaces otherwise closed to them, gathering intelligence, spreading rumors, and orchestrating covert operations. The legend of the female spy has endured. But in medieval times, these women were very much real. They were often motivated by love, loyalty, or personal gain, and they operated in a network of secrecy that transcended the rigid boundaries of their gender roles. These women were not passive participants in their world. They were active agents of change, orchestrating battles and shaping the geopolitical landscape in ways that history has largely forgotten. The unseen revolutions. But for all the courage, creativity, and rebellion of these women, they were not without their setbacks. In the male-dominated world of medieval society, even the cleverest schemes could be undone by the sheer weight of patriarchal power. Many women who dared to step outside the prescribed boundaries of their gender were punished harshly, whether it was through accusations of witchcraft, imprisonment, or even death. Women who rebelled against the established order were often silenced in the most brutal of ways. And yet, the very fact that they persisted, that they found ways to carve out spaces for themselves, speaks volumes about their resilience. They did not do so for fame or glory. They did not do so to become the subjects of history books. They did so out of necessity. Their stories, hidden in the cracks of medieval society, have endured because they are timeless tales of resistance, of ingenuity, and of the quiet power that women have always held in the face of overwhelming odds. One could argue that the medieval period was one of the most oppressive eras for women in history. The legal system was stacked against them. Society's expectations were rigid, and yet, it was in this crucible of suppression that many of the most extraordinary acts of defiance occurred. Women managed to live beyond the constraints of the time by adapting to, and, often, subverting the system in ways that were as ingenious as they were audacious. Today, their legacy endures. We see it in the modern-day feminist movements that continue to push for equal rights and representation. We see it in the quiet rebellions that women continue to wage every day, whether it's in the workplace, in politics, or in their own homes. The spirit of these medieval women lives on, not just in the history books, but in the lives of women who continue to defy the expectations of their time. In many ways, the story of medieval women isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of a quiet revolution, one that happened under the radar, out of sight of the ruling class. Their ingenuity, resourcefulness, and cunning were the building blocks for future generations of women who would not be silenced, who would not be confined to the shadows, and who would, in time, find their voices on the grand stage of history.